Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Is the pound down or up? And what does that mean? Are the markets crashing and burning or booming? And why should you care?
First Brexit, now Trump have injected massive volatility into the British economy. The kaleidoscope has been shaken and the pieces are still in flux.
Our guest in this special edition on the economy is a special guest indeed. City Editor Supreme, the doyen of city editors, from the Times to the Evening Standard. He has occupied all the commanding heights of financial journalism in Britain. I've known him for almost 30 years and never not been impressed. He is Anthony Hilton, and he's here now on board the Sputnik. Anthony, welcome. The massive volatility that Gayatri talked about, is it something that we should fear, or is it a normal up and down of the capitalist system?
I think a bit of both, to be quite honest. I think that the volatility is partly because of our kind of tectonic plate shifting, you know, that the whole globalization process is, if not unwinding, certainly stalled. And I think that's being reflected in the markets. And then the other side is that, you know, there's just so much hot money in the world now, so much money that can be mobilized at the press of a button in a way that it could never be before, that you're bound to get that much more volatility.
Well, let's look at the pound for a start. We were told in the immediate wake of the Brexit vote that the pound had never been lower. It was on the floor, might be headed for under the floor. After the Trump result, we were told that the pound had had its best week for I don't know how many decades. What does that actually mean? Why should I mean, we have very few pounds. We have no shares, nor even own property. Why should we and people like us, and bear in mind 16 million people in Britain have less than £100 in the bank, and many millions more have no bank account at all, why should ordinary people care about these fluctuations?
Well, in the case of the pound, they care because it will fairly quickly affect how much they pay for whatever they buy in the shops. I mean, a country like this, which imports half to two-thirds of its food, pays for it in sterling. If the pound drops, you have to pay more. So that transmits through into the shops in time, and you will see a bit of inflation. You'll see rising food prices.
You'll have a Marmite crisis.
Well, the Marmite is an early indication, yeah. If you like, it's the canary in the coal mine of what there could be that much more to come.
Or a bit of profiteering. The Apple surcharge on British consumers has been widely criticised as sharp practice.
Yeah, well, you always get this, don't you, that when there is a kind of excuse for putting up prices, then there will always be a few companies who do just a little bit more than perhaps they need to, just to catch up or, as you say, to make a bit more money.
Of course, a potential concomitant of all of this is import substitution. After all, if we import half, two-thirds of our food, we don't have to, do we? We can make perfectly well our own cheese, our own butter, and many of the things that we buy cheaply from foreign sources at the moment.
Probably with food, we could not be self-sufficient unless we all wanted to live on potatoes or grain. But, I mean, the point you make is a valid one. But, of course, that's the point, in a way, that Trump is making in the United States about trying to take manufacturing back to the States. It's the same idea that why buy it from abroad if you can make it at home? Yeah. And the issue is that perhaps they can make it abroad more efficiently, and we would be better off doing what we do well here and selling it to them and buying from them what they can do cheaper than us. So that's the argument for trade.
Yeah, but another concomitant is exports. Gayatri has a small vintage clothes shop in the Portobello Market area. I can tell you that there's a fantastic number of foreign visitors in the Portobello area right now. I mean, a phenomenal amount, really noticeable even for me just standing guard in the, in the shop. So tourism is one invisible export. And all the other things that we actually export are now cheaper.
Yep, no, in theory anyway, yeah. I mean, to some extent, what we export has parts that we have to import first, so it's not exactly as clear-cut. But the interesting thing is that when the pound dropped after the financial crisis back in 2008, and the pound then dropped about 25%, but there was no increase in exports, or no material increase in exports. So you do wonder to what extent price is the determining factor with exports, and whether, you know, it's quality or after-sales service, or basically, are we actually producing what the world wants to buy?
Now, this is of great importance to us, and I read recently that due to the surplus of luxury apartments in New York, the rents are actually going down, and tenants are harder to find. Now, we're waiting for that day to happen here in London.
Well, it's beginning to, well, I wouldn't say it's happening to that extent yet, but, I mean, the top end of the property market in London has stalled really quite badly since...
Top end is still too far for most of the people.
I mean, oh, yeah, quite. But then that's true of New York, too. I mean, I have lots of friends in New York, and none of them live on Park Avenue, you know. I mean, let's face it, most people can't afford 40 million or whatever, or even 1 million for a house. Or even much less than that. London is now less attractive to foreign buyers for, if you like, political reasons or geopolitical uncertainty. But of course, it's more attractive in terms of they've had a drop in price because of the fall in sterling. So if you're sitting in, I know, in Singapore or in Russia, that house in a smart part of London is going to cost you 15–20% less than it would have done earlier this year. But interestingly enough, they're not coming, which is, I think, the intriguing point.
Now, you know the city inside out. We were treated in the run-up to the EU referendum to all kinds of fear stories that the City of London would basically have a plug pulled and go down the drain. We've got big institutions warning that they might relocate out of London. How serious a threat is that? And if it were to occur, wouldn't that trigger some kind of recalibration of the British economy away from finance capitalism back to what we once were as an industrial and manufacturing country?
Yeah, I think there's truth in both of those things. I mean, I would certainly say that the city is too big for the UK economy, so it is unbalanced. And there's a lot of work being done that says, in fact, the city could be 1/3 of the size and still deliver everything that the UK economy needs. And, you know, so much, it's bigger than it should be because it makes so much money, you know, and it's not lending money to the real economy. It's sort of lending money as an end in itself to make money for itself. So it could be shrunk, and that would not be disastrous for the British economy. In terms of whether they're all going to up sticks and move to Frankfurt or Luxembourg or Dublin, it's a bit too early to say. It does, well, there are two things. One, it depends on the nature of any deal that comes into place if we ever do leave the EU. And second, it is whether or not you can fudge it. You know, that if you put a few people, say, into Luxembourg and call one of them a managing director, does that mean, in fact, that the business is located in Luxembourg and can actually carry on here? So I think that whether there'll be a mass migration is still very much up in the air.
Well, that'll partly depend on what kind of Brexit, won't it? And that's what I'd like to turn to now. There's a poll today saying the majority of British people want to stay in the single market but control immigration. As we know, these two things are, at least at the moment, incompatible. You cannot have one with the other. What's your best guess on what the British government's negotiation will produce on this?
Well, as you say, their stance is they want their cake and eat it. At the moment, I think they're obviously not going to get free movement of labour or be able to restrict that, if only because, if you look at the eastern part of the EU, Poland, Romania, I mean, those countries' free movement is very integral to them. And they are not going to agree to a deal where that gets unscrambled, I would have thought. Where we end up, I mean, who knows? I wonder whether the way the world is going in 18 months, 2 years' time, whether there won't be a big rethink, in the EU as well as here. And it is possible that the whole EU project gets recast in a way that's acceptable to us. But to answer your question specifically, I think if it comes to a choice, the British government would, as it were, leave both rather than agree to free movement.
Definitely. It's politically untenable to accept free movement of labour. After all, that was the major reason
the trigger, wasn't it?
Why we voted to leave. It's therefore the case that we'll have to, as of today, formally leave the single market. But we had Steve Norris, the prominent Conservative, here just a few weeks ago. He was making the point that that doesn't necessarily mean tariffs, because German motor manufacturers don't want to see tariffs put on our goods, because we'll retaliate putting tariffs on theirs and they won't be able to sell their product. So we could be out of the single market but still trading with the members of the EU, couldn't we?
In theory, yes, but you then get into complicated things with the World Trade Organization and membership of that, which basically, I'm not an authority on the detail of it, but you can't do a favourable deal with one country, as it were, without offering it to others. And so there are complications about how you going forward. But to your point, or to Steve Norris's point about Germany sells a lot of cars here, that is true, but Germany, not many other EU countries export a great deal to us. I mean, the bulk of what we export, and it comes from Germany. Oh, and of course Ireland as well. And given that there are 28 nations in the EU and they've all got to agree to some kind of deal, then Germany is seriously outvoted, albeit it has a lot of clout.
Well, look, let's take a break there. There's much more where that came from after this. Welcome back to Sputnik. President Trump, yes, President Trump, intends both a massive increase in infrastructure expenditure and massive tax cuts. How will he deal with the resultant rise in the deficit?
He promises economic protectionism for American jobs and an end to trade deals with the world. And America at the back of the queue for the likes of TTIP?
Is all this something to fear? Or, as Roosevelt put it, is fear the only thing worth fearing? Anthony Hilton, a captain of capitalist journalism, is still with us on the Sputnik. Are you afraid of the Trump economic prescription? Seems, in orthodox capitalist terms, rather reckless. If he means it, putting the Rust Belt back to work with big infrastructure projects whilst cutting taxes seems like a recipe for ruin.
Could be, but equally it could work. I mean, clearly, take the good parts. America clearly needs, A, to provide more jobs for its people, and B, to upgrade its infrastructure. So it is worth borrowing to do that. In terms of the budget deficit in the States, they've got a lot of headroom there, quite honestly. They could run it as a deficit, or they could raise the money in the bond markets. I think the interesting thing is where this goes after that. I mean, clearly the stock market and, if you like, my capitalist friends are making a lot of money at the moment in the hope that it will revive the American economy. And if it does revive the American economy, then, you know, the bills pay for itself. You get more tax revenue, and the deficit is a transitory thing, not a lasting millstone.
Although he's going to cut taxes.
He is going to cut taxes, yes, and in a way it's a harking back to what Reagan did 30-odd years ago, and that did create a big hole in the budget, which actually was never really filled until Clinton came in. It took a long time. But in fact, you know, you probably net, the economy was better off because more people were in work, even if the overall budgetary situation was poor.
No, I predicted Trump's victory, one of the few who did, because I know the state of the Rust Belt and where that lies on the pathway to the presidency. These swing states that he won, like Wisconsin, like Michigan, like Ohio, and came very close to winning some others. The bitterness and anger in these places at the Clinton-esque burning of their industrial base was something that was always likely, it seemed to me, to scupper a Clinton running for office. Mm-hmm. After all, she was a chief advocate of the NAFTA and of TTIP and the Asian Pacific equivalent, and that's what's done for American industry, isn't it?
Well, up to a point. I mean, I think even if there'd been no NAFTA, and TTIP obviously hasn't happened, America was still vulnerable to cheap imports. Once China came on the scene with, an extra billion workers in the industrial system, then they were obviously going to flood the world with cheap goods. And America just couldn't compete.
But only if you let them, of course. And he stood outside a Ford motor plant, I presume in Michigan, certainly in the Rust Belt. And he said, if you close this factory, Mr. Ford, I'm going to put massive tariffs on anything you produce in Mexico that should have been produced in this plant. That's almost socialist talk, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you can go back to closed economies, but economic theory, and indeed the reality since the war, since 1950, is that trade between nations, with each specializing on what it does best, creates a better outcome for everybody. The trouble is that the outcomes, or the better outcomes, are not evenly shared. And the issue in the States and in the UK and indeed the rest of Europe is that the benefits of globalization have gone to a few, not the many. And so the issue is actually that should have been addressed rather than that you stop globalization, I would say.
The outcome has been beneficial for the capitalists and comprador around them, but for the mass of the people, and this is true of the Brexit debate, for the mass of the people, they don't pluck any of the fruits of globalization. So I'm asking you, as a man of the left, and you, a man who knows the capitalist system very, very well, why should we believe in free trade? What's so great about free trade? Why can't we do as much as we can, build and create for ourselves?
Because ultimately, you can't do it all. I mean, I have in my pocket an iPhone, and as I'm sure you have, we don't make those in the UK. Do you want a life without mobile telephony? Do you want a life without all sorts of products that are actually
we
produced
invented
better?
Industry here.
Indeed.
In this building is the Adam Smith Institute, or one of the offshoots of. We invented, we were the workshop of the world. Can't we make mobile telephones?
We could make mobile telephones. The issue is whether we could do them as well as somebody else. And do you want a kind of inferior mobile telephone? I mean, we made ships, we made cars, we made all the industrial fabric of the nations 150 odd years ago. But other nations came along who did it better. And we in turn have specialized in other things. And what we're good at today are computer software, health, education, finance, although it has issues. Yeah. A lot of these soft, intellectually intensive pursuits, creative pursuits, they appeal to something anarchic in the spirit of the British. But we do that extremely well. And we sell that to the rest of the world.
But it'll only be a matter...
So that's what we should specialize in, because we'll always, if you like, not always, but we might well be much better at inventing computer games than we are now at assembling a car on a production line.
Indeed, and in my own city of Dundee, that's what they do. They invent computer games. They're the world's leader in that. But, you know, the point that you make, that we should specialize in what we're good at, and better than the rest of the world at the moment. The time will come when we're no longer best at that. I mean, the Indians and the Chinese and the Russians and so on, they're not stupid people. They'll soon be able to do all those things that you say we specialize in just as well, if not better than us. And then where will we be?
Yes, but I mean, that's a separate issue that I think is different from this debate. Because, I mean, I think the real challenge is not sorting out the mess we're in now. It's the mess to come with the advent of digital technology. I mean, there are surveys done which say that a quarter of businesses will be out of business within 5 years because of the impact of technology. That, you know, half the children in school will have to find jobs that haven't even been invented yet. You know, the real threat to the UK, to the US, to Europe, is coming from this huge technological wave that is about to break on our shores. And while we're, as it were, focusing on the issues of globalization and you know, whether we can recreate a motive industry or whatever, we're ignoring a much bigger threat that's just coming towards us.
Are you suggesting that it comes from the East?
It's coming from technology and the application of technology, and the fact, you know, it could be robotics, it could be
or AI. It comes down to it, yeah.
Or AI, all these things, which we're at a kind of tipping point in technology, which is going to sweep away so many jobs that, you know, what's happened so far is just a prelude, and that's, I think, we need desperately to start educating our kids in school to cope with what is coming, rather than sort of focusing on trying to recreate what we had, you know, 30, 50, even 100 years ago.
Is Trump a man of the left or a man of the right, economically speaking?
Actually, bizarrely, a lot of what he says is of the left. I mean, the infrastructure spend and so on is really quite Keynesian and quite at odds with liberal economics, and indeed at odds with a lot of what his own party in Congress believe. So
and at odds with the so-called Democratic Party, once the party of the working class in America.
So there are interesting tensions in the Trump program of how much he will get through before, you know, he starts meeting hostility within, as it were. And it may well be on the budgetary point, you know, your point about the tax cuts, that much as Republicans like tax cuts, they also like balanced budgets. And, you know, the two are incompatible in the short term.
Well, George Bush Sr., you remember, famously said, read my lips, no new taxes.
Indeed.
And indeed lost the election largely on that broken promise. But isn't Trump setting out to show us that something that the capitalists would rather leave hidden? Namely, that issues like the deficit and so on are a kind of smoke and mirrors trick, because as QE proves, you can print money.
Indeed.
If the money is being used for good, productive purposes, as you say, the net result is positive.
Yeah. I mean, if you can borrow at 1% and what you're building is worth yielding 2 or 3 or 4%, why wouldn't you do it? The issue with government spending is when you don't get anything in return, or you know, you're not actually improving the infrastructure, be it schools, hospitals, roads, whatever the chosen thing might be. So it's quite easy to borrow money and squander it. And Zimbabwe, if you like, is the oft-quoted example. But deficit financing by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how you use the money.
Adam Smith just fell off his perch elsewhere in this building. Anthony Hilton, it's been a pleasure, as always, talking to you. In a word, are you an optimist or a pessimist about Britain's future?
Oh, I'm an optimist. People adjust.
Anthony Hilton, the doyen of financial journalists, joining us for a special edition on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So we wondered what President Trump will mean for Great Britain and the world economy. So Zamir Akhtar says there are too many variables to judge at the moment. Protectionism and civil strife, perhaps? And Jan says, I really hope for positive radical change, but I can't see the establishment giving up neoliberalism. Radical change will happen only through people power. And Joey Zar says, do as Wall Street says or die. And finally, JD1 says, I can see some roof thatchers being busy right now.
That's the big question I should have asked. Is it a wig or not? Some people say that it isn't. I hope nothing bad
amazing.
happens to President Trump, but I do hope someone gets close enough to pull his wig off, because that would be the ultimate ignominy. Whether Trump is a man of the left or the right is, of course, an open question. But I've got to be honest with you. For me, his economic plans, as announced, are of the left, not
like
of the
Anthony
right.
said, exactly.
Yeah.
That's all the tweets that we have time for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media through Twitter, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.